Oil just climbed past $85 a barrel, and the reason has almost nothing to do with supply and demand in the usual sense. It has everything to do with a stretch of water barely 30 miles wide. That's the Strait of Hormuz, and right now it's quietly deciding how much you pay at the pump, how expensive your next flight will be, and how nervous central banks around the world are getting. Most people have never sailed anywhere near it. Most people never will. But before this conflict began, somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade, along with roughly a fifth of its liquefied natural gas, passed through that one stretch of water every day, depending on which tracking agency's numbers you look at. When a passage that important gets contested, the effects don't stay local. They move through shipping insurance, through airline fuel budgets, through the price of fertilizer, and eventually through a grocery bill that has nothing obviously to do with the Middle East. Now, here is exactly what's actually happening on the ground. Back in late February, the United States and Israel launched military strikes on Iran. Iran responded the way it had threatened to for decades. It moved to choke off the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage that carries somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the world's oil trade every single day. Iranian forces laid mines, boarded ships, and warned vessels connected to the U.S., Israel, or their allies to stay out entirely. Shipping through the strait didn't slow down. It nearly stopped. International monitors reported roughly 20,000 mariners and around 2,000 ships stranded in the Persian Gulf in the early weeks of the war, unable to move in either direction. By April, the U.S. had answered with its own blockade on Iranian ports, and the two countries spent weeks locked in a standoff over who controlled access to one of the most important choke points in the global economy. A ceasefire came in early April. Then, in June, mediators announced a memorandum of understanding, signed by the presidents of both countries, meant to formally end the conflict within 60 days. For a moment, it looked like the story was closing. It wasn't. In the first week of July, Iran attacked ships again, this time along a route near Oman that had been used to keep some shipping moving outside Tehran's direct control. The U.S. answered with a new wave of strikes. Within days, Washington reimposed its naval blockade on Iranian ports, and Iran's Revolutionary Guard escalated its own rhetoric, warning that Middle East energy exports would be, in its words, either for everyone or for no one. The strikes and counterstrikes have not been symbolic. Iranian officials said one recent round of U.S. strikes hit an army barracks, killing at least 7 troops and wounding more than 260 people. On the other side, the UAE's state oil company reported that 2 of its own tankers were hit by projectiles while crossing the strait, killing 1 crew member and injuring several others. Both details come from official statements on each side, not from unverified social media claims, which is why they're worth including here. That's not a metaphor. That's a threat aimed directly at the global supply chain, stated in plain language. Now here's why the price of oil matters more than the politics behind it. Brent crude sat around $70 a barrel before this war started. At the peak of the fighting earlier this year, it spiked to nearly $120. It has since settled, but this week alone, it's climbed roughly 11% across just a few trading sessions, pushing toward $86 a barrel. That's not a small market wobble. It's the kind of move that shows up in airline ticket prices within weeks, in shipping costs within a month, and in grocery prices not long after. That, because fuel touches almost everything that gets transported anywhere. The picture on the water is mixed and worth being precise about. The U.S. Energy Department says oil is still flowing, with more than 8 million barrels crossing the strait on one recent Sunday under U.S. military escort, out of roughly 15 million barrels a day normally moving out of the wider Gulf region. At the same time, shipping tracking firms report that ordinary commercial vessels have largely stopped using the U.S. protected route near Oman since the first week of July. So oil is moving, but increasingly only under direct military protection, not as normal commercial traffic, a distinction that shows how fragile the current flow really is. So this isn't a total shutdown, but traders don't price in totals. They price in risk. And the risk of another disruption keeps rising every time a tanker is hit or a new round of strikes is announced. Let's be fair to both sides here, because this story only makes sense once you understand what each side says it's trying to do. From Washington's side, the position is that Iran broke the terms of the ceasefire first by attacking commercial vessels with no connection to the military conflict. The U.S. argues that reimposing the blockade and continuing strikes targets Iran's ability to threaten shipping, not a return to full-scale war. President Trump has said strikes could expand to infrastructure like power plants if Iran doesn't return to negotiations, though he's also said the goal isn't a long, drawn-out conflict. From Tehran's side, the position is that the U.S. and its allies never fully lifted the restrictions promised under the ceasefire, and that Iran is defending its right to control shipping through waters it considers part of its own strategic zone. Iranian officials have framed the renewed blockade and strikes as a violation of the June agreement, not a response to one. Both governments accuse the other of breaking the deal first. Neither side has produced evidence that fully settles who's telling the truth, and no independent international body has issued a ruling on it. What multiple sources do confirm is that ships have been hit, that people have been hurt on both sides of this, and that both militaries remain actively engaged in the region right now. So why does any of this matter to someone watching from thousands of miles away with no ships and no oil contracts? Because energy prices don't stay contained to one region. A sustained rise in oil prices raises the cost of diesel, which raises the cost of trucking, which raises the price of nearly everything on a store shelf. It pushes airfare higher, since jet fuel is one of an airline's biggest expenses. It adds pressure to inflation numbers just as some economies, including the U.S., had started to see inflation cool. And it complicates decisions for central banks that were beginning to weigh interest rate cuts because a fresh energy shock can undo months of progress on inflation in a matter of weeks. There's a political layer to this too. Rising energy prices are landing in the middle of an election cycle in the United States, where control of Congress is on the ballot in November. That gives lawmakers on both sides a reason to either push for a faster resolution or use the conflict as leverage in unrelated domestic fights. And early signs of that are already showing up, with competing spending proposals tied to the war appearing in Congress this week. The ripple effects are already visible outside the Middle East. In Latin America, currencies like the Mexican peso have wobbled as renewed U.S.-Iran tensions and a stronger dollar complicate what had been an improving inflation picture, and Brazil's central bank has kept rates restrictive partly for the same reason. Neither economy has any direct stake in the Strait of Hormuz, yet their policy decisions are being shaped by it in real time. There was even a moment earlier this week where the conflict briefly touched shipping costs directly. President Trump had floated a 20% fee on cargo passing through the strait under U.S. military protection, before dropping the idea after pushback from the shipping industry and after the International Maritime Organization said mandatory tolls in the strait would be illegal under international law. It's a small detail, but it shows how far this dispute has reached, from missile strikes to who gets to charge who for using open water. And as of today, the warning has moved beyond markets and analysts. The head of the International Energy Agency said the global economy faces a renewed and serious challenge if this crisis isn't resolved within a matter of weeks, not months. That's not a think tank guess. That's the world's leading energy watchdog putting a rough timeline on how much runway is left before the disruption starts doing lasting damage. So where does this go from here? There are a few realistic paths, and it's worth being honest that nobody, including the people negotiating directly, knows for certain which one plays out. One possibility is a return to something closer to the June agreement, where both sides step back, shipping stabilizes, and oil prices ease as risk comes out of the market. That would likely require renewed diplomatic pressure, possibly from mediators who helped broker the original Memorandum of Understanding, and a face-saving way for both governments to de-escalate without looking like they backed down in front of their own domestic audiences. A second possibility is a prolonged, lower-intensity standoff, where neither side fully retreats, ships keep moving but at reduced volumes, and oil prices stay elevated without spiking to the crisis levels seen earlier this year. That scenario could stretch on for months, with periodic flare-ups every time a ship is hit or a new strike is launched, keeping traders on edge without tipping into full-blown war. A third, more serious possibility is further escalation, where continued attacks on shipping or infrastructure push the conflict back toward the intensity seen in the opening weeks of the war, when oil briefly neared $120 a barrel. Analysts caution that this remains possible, though not the most likely outcome right now, given that both governments have publicly signaled they want to avoid a full return to open war, even while continuing to strike at each other. Whichever direction this takes, the Strait of Hormuz has become one of the clearest examples of how a single geographic choke point can move global markets more than any central bank meeting or corporate earnings report ever could. It's a reminder that geopolitics doesn't stay in the news section. It shows up in your fuel bill, your flight price, and your grocery receipt, often before most people even realize why. It's also a reminder of how fast this can swing in either direction. Oil went from around $70 a barrel to nearly $120 in a matter of weeks when this war first broke out, then eased back down once the ceasefire held. That kind of swing shows how sensitive energy markets are to a handful of decisions made far from where most of us are watching this unfold. We'll keep tracking this story as it develops because a situation like this rarely resolves in a straight line. If understanding how power, money, and geopolitics connect is useful to you, this channel breaks down stories exactly like this one, twice a week, without the noise.